Hi everyone, welcome to the Italian Research Seminar. I'm Charles Levitt, pardon me, I'm making a mess here. Still Charles Levitt, Associate Director of the Center for Italian Studies and Associate Professor of Italian and Film here at the University of Notre Dame. And I wanted to welcome you to this Italian Research Seminar, which is sponsored by the Center for Italian Studies and co-sponsored by the Department of History. So I'm very glad to see so many colleagues from history with us today. And in large measure, it's because the center, the mission of the Center for Italian Studies is to support research and education in the languages, cultures, and peoples of Italy's past, present, and future from a broad array of disciplinary perspectives. So that means that it is important for us to work with colleagues from across the university and to have you all here for our seminar this evening. And having said that, then I want to turn the floor over as soon as possible to our speaker, who is Professor Rachel Midura. She's assistant professor of early modern European and digital history at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. She's at work on her first book, Princes of the Post: Power, Publicity, and Europe's Communications Revolution, 1500 to 1700, on the origin of Europe's postal systems. Her recent article, Itinerating Europe, which appeared in the Journal of Social History in summer 2021, uses social network analysis to compare conceptions of space in postal itineraries published from the 16th through the 18th centuries. And Professor Midura finished her PhD in early modern European history in 2020 at Stanford University, where she was also senior graduate research fellow at the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. And her talk this evening is entitled Deadly Letters, Plague, Banditry, and Heresy in Early Modern Mail. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rachel Midura.
All right, thank you. So I want to definitely begin by thanking the Center for Italian Studies and the History Department for hosting me. Thank you, Charles, Giovanni, Demetrio, for organizing, and to you for joining us tonight. I'm still revising this book, so this is a work in process, and I really appreciate the opportunity to present this material and get your feedback and questions. I may go through some slides quicker than the information on them should really allow, so in that case, if anybody would like to follow along, you're able to access the slides at bit.ly/deadly_letters. So as Charles mentioned, my presentation today relates to my first book project, and this is tentatively titled, so you may have seen one or two different versions floating around. But Princes of the Post: Power, Publicity, and Europe's Communications Revolution from 1500 to 1700. In short, emperors, kings, and popes relied on couriers to carry official correspondence, news, and legislation. By the 16th century, a single family dominates European postal networks. This is the Tassis family, or as they're known today, Turn and Taxis. This family was originally imperial subjects from the borders of Milan and Venice, but they go on from there to become the official postmasters to the Dukes of Milan, the popes, the Spanish kings, and Holy Roman emperors. The book project follows this family, their agents, and their rivals throughout the 16th through and 17th centuries, from northern Italy, where they get their beginning, to Austria, Spain, and the Spanish Netherlands. Far from impartial actors, I show that postmasters and postmistresses were key players in early modern diplomacy, commerce, and journalism. So this is just roughly to say that today I will be picking up right in the middle with chapter 3 on the various dangers faced by these individuals. This chapter was an interesting one, and it's actually a new one from when I finished the dissertation. It very much focuses on the dangers of communications in trying and uncertain times, much like our own have been in recent years. It really came from the helpful feedback I'd received from a book workshop, as well as reflecting on my own experiences of late, and the fact that I really hadn't addressed the question of disease and how plague affects these networks, right? In fact, the plagues of 1575, 76, and 1630, 1631 were devastating Italy at a really crucial period for the development of these networks. Then, as now, disease comes with other forms of upheaval, from economic shocks to crime and religious and social dissent. What I found in really thinking about what this period meant for the postal systems was that these threats had actually played a critical role in the success of postal systems, which was a little counterintuitive, but it's what I'll talk about today. So my general outline for today's talk will be first to provide some background. And for those of you who've heard me talk at another thing in the last few days, this may cover some similar ground. But to kind of orient you to what's going on with postal systems and what makes them distinct and why they come out of northern Italy. I'll then address how these various threats in the later 16th and early 17th centuries give these state-sponsored postal systems a distinct advantage over their many competitors. I'll move from the most concrete threats of bandits shooting the courier to the vectors of physical disease, letters as vectors of physical disease, and then finally vectors of viral ideas, right? This is very much the age of confessional conflict. In each case, I argue that trust in state institutions comes after a deliberate campaign to foster distrust in all the alternatives. State postmasters and couriers portray their rivals as either malicious foreign agents or hapless abettors. They advertise, on the other hand, their own professionalism and their sacrifices in these dangerous times, acting as a kind of essential personnel. In doing so, they exploit a kind of growing distrust between rulers and their unruly subjects in this age. So we begin in Bergamo. And this is one of the earliest printed maps, actually. I was looking for this image earlier in Margaret Messer's class. This is the Rome-Weg Carta. And it's a little confusing because it's flipped orientation. So Rome, being the destination par excellence, is at the top of the map, right, with Northern Europe at the bottom. So Bergamo in Italy's Lombardy region is located along a number of historical routes that lead across the Alps, right, into Italy. We can see this with the dotted line going right through Bergamo here. This was a key geographic position on the borders of the Duchy of Milan and the first, initially the Duchy of Milan, which becomes a Spanish and imperial possession, the Land Empire of Venice, and then the Swiss Grisons region to the north with Valtellina. Residents of Bergamo's valleys, and actually even one valley, the Val Brembana, really come to dominate all mail systems in that area by the late Renaissance. So they succeed by virtue of being these networkers, but they have a distinct structural advantage coming from this geography as well, and just really a kind of cultural brokerage on the edges of these empires. By the 15th century, a Venetian company of couriers adopts the formal structure of a trade school, a scuola. This is a common form of kind of trade confraternity in Venice. This company is so dominated by these Bergamaschi that it is also commonly referred to as the Compagnia dei Bergamaschi, in addition to the Compagnia dei Corrieri. The Venetian couriers had a state privilege for carrying letters to and from the Venetian government, as well as its agents in the Land Empire and diplomats abroad. In 1490, the couriers assembled their company charter, which is shown here. This is often referred to as the Mariegola. And it has these really beautiful illustrations of St. Catherine, who is the patron saint of messengers, and some little marginalia of her watching over their journeys. The 32 memberships in this company are often inherited and sold within a really tight-knit group of these Bergamaschi families. The Tassis are one of these families. They rise to prominence in part because they secure an early contract to act as papal postmasters, in addition to remaining active within the Venetian Company of Couriers. Then they hitch their horse to another really important dynasty, and this is the Habsburg rulers of the Holy Roman and later Spanish empires. So Emperor Maximilian gives the first surviving postal contract of this new imperial system to one Gianetto Tassis in 1490. It charged Gianetto with establishing postal way stations from the Netherlands to Italy through the Swiss Grisons, again, very much passing through the Tassis homeland outside of Bergamo. Most missions run in the early 16th century can be characterized as extraordinary. What that means is that they're run incidentally, as the ruler needs, often sent at the fastest possible speed at the greatest possible cost. A postal system, it's worth noting, is distinguished from other mail systems because it relies on posts. These are essentially way stations, right, staging posts, places that you can ride and relay, so you can pick up a new horse, right, continue the fast speed. You can also pick up and distribute mail or rest, right, as necessary. Many of these way stations are located at inns, and because the innkeeper can, easily keep the horses as well as feed the courier. This was an exceptionally expensive system of keeping horses at the ready. Horses are very expensive in this period. And it was really focused on these single routes, right? It's meant to connect the ruler, wherever the ruler might be, to the courts and the diplomats that he needs to communicate with. Nonetheless, this is a really advantageous position for the Tausis, and it's one that pays off both in terms of financial and social profit. So we have here, this is from a set of tapestries that are commissioned by the Tausis. And you can see Francesco Tausis, brother to Gianetto, handing the mail to Maximilian, right? Really making the claim that they're serving in this important role. So this is also helpful just as a reminder of what the Habsburgs are up to in this period. So everywhere you see in green is a Habsburg territory by the mid-16th century. This is specifically at the time of the abdication of Charles V. And this helps give a sense of why this geography is so important, right? In terms of a north-south axis, you're absolutely going to be passing through Milan, and same with going east-west, right? Going from Madrid to Vienna or Innsbruck. So really the crossroads of Europe in many ways. So now let's talk about some of the dangers of running this network. So I would actually be really curious if anybody's come across this in a more modern context, but chi corre in posta con la morte scherza, right? He who rides by post plays with death, right? A real contemporary recognition of this danger. Now, granted, I think this may have had a meaning like live fast, die young in the modern English, right? But the point being that this was recognized as, you know, a metaphorical danger. And this is a really awesome portrait from the mid-16th century of the Cursor Germanus, right? So very much the individual who's, I think, crossing the Alps, carrying a distinctive postal horn, right? So that curved horn, which we still see sometimes in European postal system logos, that was the horn that could be blown to alert the next way station that the courier was coming, right? To ready the horses and keep everything going as quickly as possible. So this Italian proverb, you know, recognizes this violence, right, that the courier faces. So for today, I'm going to begin by asking to what extent this kind of violence and the dangers more generally were inevitable and even environmental. And to what extent they instead represent a deeper political struggle for centralizing state control in northern Italy. The crime of attacking a courier is so prevalent by the mid-16th century that it acquires its own Italian term. This is svaliggiamento, from the verb svaliggiare. This is a term that I occasionally see used for highway robbery more generally, but I think it comes from those attacks on couriers. And the reason is because it's the use of that S prefix, right, to take away the valigia, the bag. And the valigia is, you know, what the courier is really associated with. Here, on the other hand, we have, so svaliggiamento, probably the most famous use of it is Ferrante Pallavicino's epistolary novel, Il Corriere Svaliggiato, the courier waylaid. And in fact, this is a genre I talk about more generally in the book. This is another example where it's actually the gods of Olympus waylaying Mercury, right? So you can see he's carrying that bag, and they're trying to get it away from him to read the letters. So this is a pretty common crime. If it's, like, again, appearing in John Florio's dictionary, right, of Italian to English terms to describe this. And he says it's to uncase one by the highway, right? Kind of an awkward translation into the English, but it gives you a sense of literally what that refers to. So historians of violence have long read banditry as a form of resistance to this kind of centralizing, monopolizing impulse of the state. As states sought to distinguish and protect their postal couriers, they strengthened that association between the couriers and occupying powers. That's true for the Spanish, who have taken control by the mid-16th century of the Duchy of Milan, but it's also true for the Venetians, who've extended their land empire way out into northern Italy. So I've collected a number of incidents of attacks on couriers, and that's what you see represented here, is essentially a map of these incidents as I found them in state archives from around the mid-16th century to around 1630. What I see from this, and the points are sized by the number of assaults that I can associate with a given place. What I would do is I use this to really explore the geography and the geographic story of this. One thing I want to highlight, which I don't think comes through well here, is that actually more than half of these instances occur in just 13 years, which is between about 1598 and 1611, so really the turn of the century. The greatest number of assaults, which are 5 different incidents, take place in and around Cremona. And the reason that's significant in part is because you can see, again, these places along borders are really dangerous because the bandits know they can get across the border very quickly. It becomes a big jurisdictional issue. They escape the reach of the state. So one of the things that policing against these attacks does is it pushes forward a number of extradition agreements between these states, even in times when the polities themselves are not necessarily getting along. So now what I'll do is I'll talk about some of the similarities that I see with these incidents, in addition to that kind of geographic story. Another thing I want to pull out, actually, is that this, of course, occurs along the postal route, right? That's maybe pretty intuitive, but this route in particular is one that I spend a lot of time on in the book, and I call the Italian Road. It's important because it connects Milan and Venice, and it does so through a postal treaty, essentially, and a treaty that's done between the Tassis postmaster of Milan and that Venetian company of couriers. And this, crosses a number of different borders, which we get a better sense of that when we look at it here. But it also establishes the ordinary couriers. So I'd said before that at the start, this is a system where couriers are extraordinary. They're sent by the king when he's got a letter to send, right? Fastest speed, fastest expense. By the time we're getting to the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century, this is a system that runs ordinary couriers on a set timetable. You know where the courier will be and the route he will be traveling, which unfortunately renders them all the more vulnerable to this kind of attack. But basically, this road is being run in, along the northern route from Venice to Milan and then back again, going through Cremona, right, and Mantua. So I'll return to this map in a bit. So most assaults on these couriers seem motivated by the simple desire to rob them, right? That's my first answer to this question of, is this a greater political story about resisting the state? Well, these couriers are carrying some really valuable goods. That, to me, as a historian, is why these assault incidents are so useful, is because it's very hard to look into the mailbag and get a sense of that. But they start to do inventories of losses, right, when these attacks happen. So I'm going to read a little bit from an inventory of losses of the courier of Mantua, who was attacked outside of Verona in 1587. So the inventory includes, quote, a golden parrot with many jewels and pearls, a golden girdle, a great quantity of silver spoons and forks, many diamonds and fine rubies in a small box, a silver plate of about 13 pounds, a few gold necklaces, 2 silver ewers, and a good deal of Venetian coins. This is all on the courier. So it makes it clear that these couriers are not just carrying mail, right? And in fact, the quantity of goods here makes me think this was very likely to be a coach or a carriage of some kind, even though it's not called out as such. And so we're starting to see these postal coaches aren't necessarily run as such, but the couriers are hitching a ride when possible. And there's a couple more cases that make that a little more explicit. So it shows us the degree to which the system is integrated into this wider network of exchange, of travel, and even hospitality, right, the inns. And not to mention that kind of travel by these slower vehicles would have rendered the courier, again, all the more vulnerable to this kind of attack. So gangs of highwaymen who targeted couriers were often based in inns. This is especially noteworthy given that inns were also the staging posts of this postal system. And in fact, I found quite a few cases where the bandits are then later identified as relatives of an innkeeper. With the regular flow of gossiping travelers, inns could act as an intelligence hub to identify these kind of money-laden targets, right? Civic authorities already regarded inns with great suspicion in northern Italy, located as they were on the outskirts of towns and filled with dangerous foreigners or soldiers, as we see here. Milanese legislation routinely forbade the residents of the city from dining in inns, right? They were trying to avoid that kind of social mixture, if you will. When bandits of one attack were eventually traced to an inn at Salvaterra, the authorities concluded that, quote, since it does not serve another purpose than the entertainment of young men, for which it is very appropriate, it seems appropriate to demolish this place, where otherwise it will require the utmost diligence to prevent murderous robberies. So inns, interestingly, a source of danger in addition to shelter. So a lot of these incidents, I'll say, come from these kinds of compendiums of edicts that are really becoming big, especially in Milan at the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century. And many of these edicts are very specifically like against those who attacked the courier November 4th, right? So they give some great details. And some of those details show me a couple of other similarities. First, in most incidents, the bandits are armed, they're carrying arms, and there's actually a bit of an arms crisis going on in northern Italy at this point in time. There's a good book, Colin Rose's Renaissance of Violence was really helpful for thinking about this. But in any case, even though they were carrying guns and sometimes the courier gets shot, he's very rarely killed. Bandits did not murder the messenger when they could avoid it. Instead, they often tied the courier between two trees, which seemed sufficient to keep him from raising an immediate alarm. Because otherwise his job is to go to the next town and raise a posse, essentially, to go and hunt the bandits. But this and the fact that guards often actually imprison the courier after this kind of attack suggests that there was some suspicion that the couriers were colluding with the bandits in one way or another, or that they knew more about the identity of their countrymen than they were offering. There's also a consistent effort among the highwaymen to disguise their identities. So I frequently see references to them wearing face masks, cloth pulled over their faces, turning their clothes inside out, which I think is interesting. I think that might be foreign soldiers trying to disguise any kind of identifying insignia. And these attacks also often take place at river crossings. So they take place at borders, but they also take place at river crossings where they could escape by boat as well as over land. Finally, the summer months bring a higher rate of criminal violence across the board, and this maps on to what Colin Rose finds about just murder in general. But the frequency of courier assaults may have also corresponded with financial fairs that were taking place. So this is an excerpt from one of the postal itineraries that I spoke about in yesterday's talk. And it's an example of the kind of miscellaneous material that makes it in that's in addition to the routes. It's just a list of all the financial fairs that take place and when. And so you can see there's a prevalent number of fairs in the summer for which merchants would have been moving a lot of specie and other goods in advance of this. So it may have made for excellent targets for banditry. So even if these attacks are not about the politics of the post, the responses certainly are. Postmasters and couriers take a very active role in petitioning for their own protection. The Spanish Postmaster Lieutenant of Milan, Ottavio Codogno, works very closely with the Spanish governor to write edicts that are against these attacks on the couriers. So I found that basically the manuscript versions that he's more or less handing to the governor to then turn into these printed edicts. So the postmasters actually see this as very much a kind of an issue of dissent, and specifically dissent against the postal systems and the importance of these postal systems. So Codogno actually argues for the adoption of a community penalization approach. Basically, if bandits attack the courier near your community, the community needs to pay restitution. It's also worth noting that while I can only say this is a correlation rather than causation, one of the biggest places that the postmasters of Milan are in conflict with local couriers is Cremona. And you can see, again, Cremona is the one where there's all these attacks. So the postmaster of Milan certainly interprets these attacks as being, people not doing their job enough, if not actually, trying to harm these postal systems. And in fact, there's a whole series of suits and countersuits between these two offices, including accusations of mail theft between the two of them. In some ways, the postal systems argue that the privileges they enjoy, right, which are increasingly monopolistic, that they should be the only mail carriers, especially for state letters. They argue that they paid for these privileges in blood. Postal couriers reference deaths and injuries in the line of duty as badges of pride and proof of their veteran status. In 1620, the Venetian Company of Couriers protests competition from rival carriers. And these carriers, I should say, are often merchants, for example. They're also local bodies of carriers, people who run one route, right? The term portalettere comes up a lot, just whoever's carrying letters between, Venice to Padua once a week. So these are the people that postal systems are increasingly trying to edge out of their market, so to speak. In this case, the couriers cite a recent attack on one Giovanni Bensoni, who, quote, without regard for his own life, was happier to die right there on the road rather than voluntarily give the state letters to assassins sent by princes. When asked for the state letters, he pulled out a pistol, shooting one, and was then killed by the others. The company cited the selfless act as proof of, quote, the disposition of the couriers to be truly faithful to their princes. So very much interpreting this as kind of a martial thing, right? An act of war, the attack on the courier. The willingness of the courier to give his life to defend the mail also rebutted the possibility that the courier had conspired with his attackers, right, to defraud the state. Both the Spanish and the Venetians proved very sympathetic audiences to this kind of petitioning, and so they do offer additional protections and privileges to messengers, protections that further distinguish these postal couriers from their many rivals. So on the whole, assaults on postal couriers show that there were persistent dangers, but they also show a new international consensus on the need for protecting these couriers. Political and commercial elites across Italy, regardless of nationality, shared the need to transport letters, money, goods, and even themselves occasionally, securely and reliably. The state expands its policing with this mandate and it's lobbied by its postal officials and told, in many cases, precisely how to provide these protections. New measures from extradition to community penalization favor these state postal services over their rivals. So now I'll move on to talk about post in a time of plague. So plague first appears, and again, plague here for the non-early modernists is completely endemic in the early modern world. There are these waves that are very devastating, and we kind of refer to a whole variety of diseases with that term of plague or pestilence, right? Now I'm talking about two incidents which were really, really nasty for northern Italy, killing up to a quarter of the population in many places, up to half in some of the terra firma cities. Which it may be a little hard to read here, but for example, there's the population of Venice goes down by nearly a third as a result of this, so really bad waves. While not yet a scientific disease theory, northern Italy certainly had a pragmatic understanding of contagion theory since at least the 14th century. The Visconti Dukes of Milan had promulgated one of the earliest set of plague quarantine laws in Europe, followed by a comprehensive reporting scheme. By the 16th century, both Venice and Milan had offices of public health that issue health passports, known as tickets, right, kind of bills of health for travel. This is an example from an edict that's saying exactly how you should write this kind of bill of health. They also have large plague hospitals, and this is I think, 19th century photograph is showing the old Lazaretto Vecchio of Milan, and then a picture from a map. So these plague hospitals are located outside of the city walls, right? They're places to move the sick, but also to stop travelers and make sure that they're not going to bring infection into the city. So then what was the impact of plague at the heart of this network, right? And it really does strike at a crucial time. The 1570s is just starting to see this growth really take off in terms of the private mail carrying especially. Postal routes naturally overlay the same pathways as disease. Both couriers and contagion naturally intersect with highly trafficked areas, densely populated cities. There's actually surprisingly little in the way of scholarship to answer this question. Some historians suggest that it shut down routes entirely, but increasingly historians of news flow especially look to these years as really rich years for a kind of pan-European information system. So how did this actually kick off? Well, in October of 1575, the Venetian diplomatic resident in Milan, Ottaviano Marzi, complains that Milanese authorities have detained the ordinary courier en route from Bergamo. So this is this is an 18th century postal map, but again, it shows that connection I was talking about before. So we're looking at Padua all the way over on the right here, and then the route passing through Vicenza, Verona, and then Desenzano being the key point for where mail is actually traded between the two systems, and then going all the way to Milan over at the left. So when the courier is stopped, he's stopped right here between Bergamo and Milan, so part of this system. So at the time, the courier is stopped, and all of his letters his packages of letters in many cases, are cut of all the twine and then fumigated. Right, and this is a pretty common practice, for example, ship cargo at the time. But the diplomat is quite annoyed about this because they don't really put the letters back together properly. They're brought in great disorder, right? Not to mention it's a security issue for the diplomatic correspondence to be stopped and messed with in this way. Excuse me one second. So that fumigation process would have taken place with basically based on how ship cargo is treated. We can guess that they would have employed fragrant woods, juniper, sulfur, oftentimes putting it in a sealed box with all of these really strong smelling things. This was believed to have a beneficial effect for disinfecting the mail. So the Venetian ambassador complains about this, but in fact, just a few days later, the Venetians are doing the same thing to correspondence coming out of Milan. In fact, there's orders given that all papers from the Lazaretto Vecchio are subject to fumigation. All the strings and cords should be removed. There was a belief that the soft materials were more likely to carry contagion. And so increasingly there's even people in Rome saying if you don't seal your letters with wire rather than string, we'll just burn everything. And sometimes they burn everything even when they're letting it in. So this is a great example I found in the State Archives in Florence of one of these, in this case, toasted letters, right? So they would have used hot coals. Sometimes you can see the marks of the tongs, or sometimes you see it where it's burned through the paper itself. So the Lazaretti plague hospitals and the disinfection process also create a strategic opportunity for espionage. So sometimes the diplomats are just being paranoid about this, and sometimes they're not, as I found in the sources. So here we have an unsigned letter to the Venetian state inquisitors saying that twice I have been able to observe the letters of the postmaster Ferdinand Tassis. Ferdinand Tassis here being the imperial postmaster based in Venice. I have done everything possible to have the letters. It is not possible because they come from the Lazaretto secured in the presence of this Tassis. So he, the postmaster, is going out to personally collect these. The letters of his confidence are kept separate for security. Your excellencies might send an expert person to the Lazaretto. Right, the idea being that they recognize this as an opportunity. Everyone recognizes this as an opportunity, including the postmaster, and that's why he's out there collecting the letters in person. That being said, sometimes the losses to the Lazaretto could be more tangible than intelligence. In 1617, the same Ferdinand Tassis is lamenting the disappearance of 30 pearls that had been included in a package and were lost during this process of disinfection, probably into someone's pocket. So another great example I just found this summer, actually. This is a whole box in the State Archives in Turin of letters that do not belong in the State Archive in Turin. It is the Venetian ambassador's correspondence in a nearly complete set. So including many of his ciphered diplomatic correspondences. But it makes sense as soon as you look at the date, which is 1630. Right, so again, there's something going on here. It includes actually one of the other documents I spent a lot of time looking at, a list of his own personal expenses on couriers that he was sending for reimbursement, but seemed not to reach their final destination. Another great source on this that I was talking about with your own resident Galileo expert. So Galileo also gets seriously inconvenienced by this. When he has to testify as to why he didn't send his dialogues on the two chief world systems, he says, it was during the plague. I talked to even the directors of the postal service to try and send the manuscript safely. I received no assurance that this could be done, and it certainly would have been damaged, washed out, or burned. Such was the strictness at the borders. So again, he had some other reasons, perhaps, for hesitancy, but this process of damaging correspondence included, I should mention as well, dipping in vinegar, especially by the 1630 plague, which could just, again, wash out all of the ink, depending on the formulas at work. But nonetheless, this also shows us something important, which is that while the other forms of commerce were stopped, and there's another part of this quote where he talks about this, let's see. Commerce was stopped, so seeing that I could not come to Rome, by correspondence I requested permission for the book to be printed in Florence. So even though these other networks are being stopped by the plague restrictions, the post is still running, right? It's still it's not always arriving perfectly, but it's still happening. And so what I found is that there's a lot of restrictions on those private carriers that are saying you cannot run your letters, right? But at the same time, Venice and Milan are telling all of their territorial possessions, you have to let our couriers through. It doesn't matter if you're worried about contagion, they have to go through. So again, this is giving a strategic advantage to these postal systems that'll pay off for them down the road. So what is the long-term effect of this? In many ways, I see the long-term effect going into the other chapters of the book, where I talk about everything that happens after the 1570s and the 1630s. One of the things that comes out of it is this establishment of the ordinary system, right? And I think part of that is the fact that, despite having some privileges, the postal systems are still suffering as a result of the plague. They're not making anywhere near as much of the revenue of carrying private correspondence as they used to. And so they start to work together in some interesting ways. And so this is the period, the 1580s is the period that sees Milan and Venice establish this postal ordinary, and working together, really, to build these systems and again, come out on top of their rivals. It's also an age of postmistresses, which is kind of interesting. So this is a map showing, some of just the Tassas relative postmistresses. I think there's actually a number of other postmistresses in more minor locations, especially in places like the Austrian Tyrol. But you can see that there's a number of these postmistresses, and part of that is a demographic impact, right? Many of these are widows. So their husbands die young, either because of that plague of violence or the plague itself. And women can play a really important role in keeping this network going in this period. Even when spared by disease, their sons are oftentimes the victims and instigators of interpersonal violence in this period. So there's many cases of, for example, a postmistress I've spent a lot of time on. She keeps running the office in Milan in part because her sons flee charges of murder for killing people in tavern brawls, which is pretty typical at the beginning of the 17th century in Milan. So the other thing I want to highlight here is that much as those couriers who fall victims to bandits really play up their sacrifice, so too do the couriers who die of plague. So here we see a manuscript version of what I think was likely a print edict commemorating the couriers who had died of the plague. And you can actually see that they say when they were carrying the state letters specifically, which again is kind of making this claim to how essential these networks are, and the dedication to the prince, the dedication to the state, trading on that really to get the state's alliance for increasingly monopolistic privileges. All right, so moving on to my last section. This is talking about rebels with cause, finally coming to talk about all those other rival groups that don't go willingly into the night. So spring, and this is jumping back in time a little bit, but spring of 1568 seems to confirm some of the worst fears for the Milanese authorities. One Giovanni da Martinengo is one of 4 Bergamaschi merchant couriers, so one of these non-postal systems, but who had run a route between Milan and Venice quite regularly. He's a well-known figure who frequently stops at an inn at the sign of the Peacock above a moat at the Porta Romana. At one point in his journeys, he leaves several bales of seemingly forgotten cloth at an inn in Verona. So again, moving goods that are other than letters. The innkeeper eventually gets curious, pokes his nose in the box, and finds a number of books published in Geneva. So he's actually semi-literate, but he knows enough to turn this over to his local inquisitor, who then reports to Cardinal Borromeo. And sure enough, it turns out that Martinengo had been smuggling these books likely for some time, right? Even these books, the books had been sitting at the inn for many years by the time that the innkeeper gets the chance to poke his nose in there. So again, this seems to confirm that these other systems are exploitable, right? For all this loyalty that the postal couriers are laying claim to, you can't trust these merchants. Right, they are playing a part in these heretical book smuggling networks as well as the correspondence networks. Governors really feared that secret networks formed a 5th column, especially the Spanish governors. Milanese inquisitors sought, quote, a type of merchant sent throughout the world with secret intelligence and correspondences, not just related to their business, but to take up arms and rise against their princes. These secret intelligences might be things like arrangements for the publication of banned books or maps of safe houses for evangelists, as authorities discover on a Milanese merchant in 1575. By the 1580s, a big character for me, Postmaster Ruggiero Tassas of Milan, is aggressively campaigning against these merchant rivals. 2 postmasters for a city are as incompatible as 2 princes, he writes. And this is, again, written to the governor saying, this is why I need you backing me up on this monopoly. He plays to the greatest fears of the Spanish rulers of Milan, Quote, all of the foreign couriers direct themselves in their own house, their own post house, and secretly and publicly collect letters and dispatches and distribute them in contempt of your majesty and the illustrious governor, from which derives much gossip and scandal. So the governor forwards this petition to the Spanish crown on behalf of Ruggiero Tassis. The governor also describes how he's been working with Ruggiero Tassis and why he believes that the Spanish crown needs to back him up on this monopoly. Quote, I wrote in past days to your majesty about people sent from England and other places to disseminate heresy in Italy and to do other things in disservice to God and your majesty. The postmaster says that such exchange is disguised as merchants' letters, which he cannot investigate, but if the letters pass through a single hand, as is suitable, it will be easy to tell this and other things, from which I may be warned of important things that he discovers. So this was my smoking gun. I was so excited to find this because I knew there had to be more of a confessional story at work here. And sure enough, this is the closest we get to a really explicit recognition that giving postal monopoly also gives unparalleled surveillance, right? It's passing through a single hand, it's passing through a single post house. You're making sure of what's being communicated within this network. So ultimately, even though this is sent on to the Spanish crown, the governor's already printed the edict, right? He's already on board with this. And sure enough, this edict, again, tries to basically group anybody else into this group of semi-illicit, really illicit carriers. And there had been a lot more diversity on this front, right? This is not a new system in many ways. There has been a great deal of mail carrying since the Middle Ages. But now the real key distinction that the postal officials are making is the state posts and everybody else. So as states counter threats to their communication systems, they listen to their technocratic specialists, even letting them literally write the regulations in many cases. Official decrees adopt their language, echoing that, this kind of, essentially what I see happening is that the couriers even bring edicts from other places to their own rulers and say, look, they're doing this in Mantua, look, they're doing this in the Netherlands. You have, precedent for laying claim to your own monopoly within your territory. Yes, and here's a great example of that. So again, Ottavio Codogno, who's just a major character for me. This is, his draft of what goes on to become this edict, right? So again, you're kind of letting the roosters run the hen house, I guess is the phrase, right? So if literally the postmasters are writing the legislation on this, this is not a good position for all of these other carriers to be in competitively. So in the history of technology and infrastructure, there's often a precipitating crisis before an overall system renewal. The decades between 1575 and 1630 see several such overlapping crises. Postal agents face a variety of dangers, from gun-toting brigands to public health roadblocks. Postal systems adapt, offering a greater variety of services to a wider clientele than ever before. The running of ordinary couriers on a cohesive route network that I explore in the many following chapters is something that's born of this crisis in many ways. It does come at a cost, and that cost is the many long-standing alternatives to the state postal system, replaced by a system that might be better protected, surveilled, and controlled by authorities. The Spanish Post Office of Milan and the Venetian Company of Couriers succeed by convincing their respective executive authorities that unlicensed mail carries a threat, right, of many different types, but the best way of controlling that is to have everything be centralized under their control. They offer new mechanisms of surveillance, from documentation of senders and recipients to opening, copying, delaying, or forwarding private mail. Sources rarely explicitly note the personal relationships among these postmasters and governors, but this is something I get into in much greater depth in other chapters. They're working together on these things like legislation. In this way, the threats of banditry, plague, and rebellion did not, in fact, cripple the postal systems, but instead made their state backing crucial against their entrenched competition. All right, and with that, I'm happy to turn over for questions.
There's some questions in the back.
I wonder if I might think that's really important. That's really, really great. Can I just ask, this is a question born out of ignorance. My understanding is that the Totem taxes are a German family with an ancestral house in at least one, in Wien or in Austrian lands.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess my question is, does that complicate the idea that they're state actors in this case? Because they are, well, certainly they're not a family that is exclusively associated with Venetian state or indeed Milan. I guess, and that question kind of points outward towards the fact that this is also for a Habsburg line family, this is also the period of 30 years of war.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how that interacts with them as specifically state actors in the Venetian Republic.
Yeah, all great points. So it's interesting. I always get a slightly different response from folks who are European themselves or know more about the European literature, because Turn and Taxis comes up a lot, right? They are very active in the modern tabloids in Germany, and they have their palace at Regensburg. So that's what's really interesting about this family is they get their start in Bergamo, right? That is the origin point for that branch of the family as well. But they reinvent themselves over time. And part of that is because they take over these different locations under Habsburg patronage. So I was looking to see if I had a good map of the Transalpine routes in here. But in the later chapters, I talk much more about this. Here we go. So all of this is being run, largely within this TASIS system. And so they, the headquarters for the, what becomes the most important branch of the family is first Antwerp, then Brussels, and then eventually moves to Regensburg, where their family archives are located today. And so, in short, yes, it's always complicated for them. They start as the postmasters to Venice, Milan, the Pope. That's already bridging three extremely contentious groups in the mid-16th century. And then by the time that Charles V abdicates, they continue to work for the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs and the imperial branch. Theoretically, they're supposed to work together, right? And this becomes especially tense in this division here in northern Italy, because Milan is a part of the Spanish network, and then Venice becomes a part of the imperial network. So they quite literally have different patrons at that point, but they're cousins, and they're supposed to work together to make sure that the mail goes back and forth between those two systems. Now, those two cousins hate each other, and so it actually gets really interesting, and that's one of the reasons that I see Milan working with the Venetian Company of Couriers instead of the imperial postmaster in Venice. So all of this is to say, yes, it is very complicated, and they actually, in general, do a really excellent job of navigating these many different national identities from the outset. I kind of follow them until they no longer really trumpet that Italian identity as much as they used to. And a key place where I leave off is with the kind of reinvention of this system that's done in part by a really powerful postmistress general, Alexandrine de Bry von Taxis. So like many diplomatic families, for example, they marry abroad, right? They marry into local patrician classes. And so they start to publish genealogies by the 17th century, which are saying, oh, no, actually, right, we're in Bergamo, but we can link ourselves to all of these different royal dynasties. And they publish them in French. They're much more looking to make an impact on the kind of northern network at that point in time. And so in many ways, that's the end of the Italian Tasis, and it's the beginning of the princes of Turn and Taxis by the time we get to the late 17th, early 18th century. So I think that got through all of that. Okay.
I think Patrick, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I'm wondering, given the nature of the job, you can see why it was worth the power grab that they were trying to make with these idiosyncratic and papal and diplomatic careers that they had. But I wonder if you came across any information about specifically what their financial compensation looked like, and if you did, what that might be equivalent to today.
Yeah.
It's kind of stretched.
Great question. Yeah, so I do a little bit of that calculation. It's always tricky because the postal records are developing the record-keeping practices as they go, and so doing comparability across time and geography can get really tricky. I've done it for Milan, where I have some really good records, specifically because they get audited. And based on what I found, the courier, I think, what was it? Your average laborer's wage in Milan is kind of about a lira a day at that point in time. A courier could expect to earn a little bit more than that, but not a lot, like maybe a lira and a half. Now, that being said, that's for carrying the state mail, and a lot of this was going on off the books, because as far as the state is concerned, this private business is extremely suspect and potentially stopping their letters from arriving as soon as they should. So, you know, what I ultimately conclude in some of the chapters is we just can't get a sense of what kind of, you know, under the table dealing is happening at the end of the 16th century when it's still not technically a system that's meant for private mail carrying. Certainly they do a lot of favors for people like carrying clocks. I've actually seen a great quote of where someone's complaining about how he wasn't getting paid enough, so he had to carry a clock over the Alps to Prague for some patron, which, you know, I immediately imagine like a Big Ben style clock, right? Since he's complaining about it, it must have been something somewhat heavy.
There's a question here, and then go there.
It's a question about the fumigation process and kind of when that starts developing, or if you can see a trend line at which point it becomes more common. Because the reference that comes to mind is Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, when Friar Lawrence is not able to get a letter out to Romeo, who's been exiled to Mantua, and that spoils the entire plot, and Romeo ends up, you know, not getting to marry his blood. But the scene is Friar Lawrence has sent his buddy Friar John out to Mantua to go contact Romeo and give him this letter, and you know, shortly after we see Romeo announce he's going to kill himself back in Mantua, Friar John comes back to Friar Lawrence and says, I wasn't able to go. There's plague, and they're so afraid of the pestilence and the infection that not only could they did ignore me, they locked me in. And I couldn't get anybody as a messenger to go and take it, but I also couldn't send it back to you by post. So I couldn't contact you, and I couldn't push it forward. Which suggests that fumigation is not happening in at least like Shakespeare's time quite, or he's imagining a period where it's not quite in place. Which prompts the question, right? Are there certain letters that people are willing to do fumigation for? Is it an extra service? Do you pay a few extra bucks and you can pass, you know, for plaguing? Or is it at some point kind of a generalized process? We need to get all the mail fumigated. Yeah, great question. And a great reference, actually. So I've been talking to Mark Bradshay, who's done some of this work on the English diplomatic couriers, and he was telling me that actually he can show that an English diplomatic courier who'd done a lot of this running of the routes is Shakespeare's neighbor at one point in time. And so he can't draw any clearer connection than that, but he's like, I bet anything, right, that Shakespeare's getting some, like, surely he would have wanted to talk to the guy who'd spent all this time in Italy and everything. So it's interesting to think about that, since Mantua is big in the imperial postal system. You know, I think my take on that, the kind of fumigation we see happening, that's like the diplomatic correspondence going in and out of these big urban hubs, right, where they had the lazaretto, they could do this process, you know, in a more or less institutionalized way. The fact that they're constantly having to tell the smaller places to let the couriers through indicates to me that, you know, a lot of these terra firma cities would just as soon completely close their doors, and they're having to be told not to. So my guess is you would have a lot more trouble with some places, you know, I mean, walled cities, essentially, that would say, nope, closed for business. And that's an issue that the couriers run into constantly anyway, is that, you know, walled cities have, and Wolfgang Behringer has a good book on this in the Holy Roman Empire, walled cities will close their gates at a certain time of day, and they don't care if the courier is a little bit late, right? The gates are done. So I guess the short answer to that is I think it depended where you were as well as who you were. Yeah, just to follow up, is fumigation something that particularly the Tassis family is doing? Is it pretty exceptional, and do they have some sort of natural philosophy like backing for that? Are they pleased with the results?
Well, so it's not the Tassis who are doing it. It's the Lazaretti. It's basically the magistracy for public health. Okay. If anything, the Tassis are the ones going to the ruler saying, "Is this really necessary?" Right? this is a huge pain. And so I think, you know, for that I would really kick you over to Katharina to talk more about the natural philosophy behind it. Basically, what I've been doing is just looking to what was happening with other kinds of goods, and then drawing those connections to the language that's being used, for example, by the diplomats, right? When they're saying something is profumate, what could they mean by that?
I should have followed up to that. What are the literary sources like? Is they, what's their typology, or how do you use them? And then I had the second question is, what's the rationale for the start date of 1500? Is there any particular significance there?
Yeah,
Just
thank you.
Curiosity, really, the second question. But
Yeah, so was it on literary sources on the Post or literary sources on Plague?
the Post, I'm
Okay.
thinking, you know, it's like, are there picaresque, picaresque novels, travel literature? That, is there value in that for this type of research?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a chapter that goes into what I call the mailbag novel. And this is an example of a mailbag novel. And it's a type of epistolary novel, right? It's told in the form of letters, but it's specifically letters that have been stolen from a mailbag. So not letters that speak to one another, but rather letters that just happen to be together by virtue of the assault. And so the most famous by far is Ferrante Pallavicino's Waylaid Courier, but actually that's not the first one. And he's often attributed authorship of other books that there's really no reason for, and this is one of them, where it just happens to follow that same style. And so I actually think, you know, I don't want to get too off track here, but one of the things I argue is that these books are advancing an early public right to know. They're basically saying if the state is reading your letters, why can't we read the state's letters, right? Or look at, you know, our neighbors' letters, right? Isn't it better if all of this is just kind of shown to everyone and it becomes a mirror for society, much like a mirror for princes? And so, you know, these have been really fascinating to think with, especially because they're so based on this assumption that the Northern Italian readers would know exactly what they're referring to when they refer to various postal practices or, you know, some letters being written in cipher or invisible ink, right? That these would have been common enough that they could be used as metaphors to describe, for example, someone who was like extremely pompous in their prose. Right, there's a good passage where one of the wits who's commenting on these letters they've stolen says, you know, I really need like some spices in order to figure out what on earth this letter is meant to mean. And that refers to the fact that there were certain, you know, chemicals you could use to make invisible ink apparent, right? But in this case, he's saying it's just because it's so poorly written.
Is this the origin of the epistolary novel? I mean,
I think, yeah, I mean, this, you'd have to talk to a lit scholar. This is one where I don't want to go out too far on a branch, but I mean, certainly this style of novel, I would say. And again, this, you know, there's other precedents, especially in terms of kind of political treatises. Like I draw the connection to News from Parnassus, right, which is very contemporary to all of this. And similarly, sometimes uses, you know, some references to the gods on Olympus having these discussions or allegorical figures, right? But again, it's being told through these letters, which I think is really fascinating. The start date of 1500, that's in part because I have to draw some lines somewhere, as it usually is. It's in part because that's when the Tassus family come about. And they are main characters for me. It's not just about the Tassus, but it's really about how they shift things. And the system starts to go through a cycle of reinvention pretty quickly at that point. So they received the first contracts, you know, 1490s. And then by some time like 1505, there start to be some real political issues. So the Tassus are actually expelled for a time from the Venetian Company of Couriers. Genetto Tassus tries to retire, and he gets harassed first by imperial troops and then by Venetian troops. And so they're experiencing some tough times with navigating, you know, these multiple allegiances that I think is really interesting.
There's a question over there first.
Yes, thank you again for that. It's very fascinating, and I hope this isn't too broad a question or one that doesn't speak directly to what we've worked on directly. I'm thinking of how well you've developed the state centralization aspect of postal surveillance within lands that are directly under imperial control, like Milan and elsewhere. I'm wondering about, say, like the Grand Duchy of Florence and these other like smaller Italian states that are maybe within the imperial orbit. Are they carrying out, number one, do they have their own, like say, Florentine postmasters that are setting up their own internal network? And are they carrying out a surveillance, their own surveillance for their own reasons, or are there imperial postmasters at work there that are running their own surveillance networks?
Yeah, great question, thank you. Yes, so one of the first key reinventions for the system is you start from having the postmaster who's, again, like that tapestry portrait, right, at the king's side, handing him his letters. Shortly after, by the 1530s, 1540s, you're starting to see postmasters in residence. So we're going to go send someone to be our postmaster in Rome, right? And so it uses the same terminology, but it faces a very different set of issues, right, to be a postmaster abroad. And so they do have those connections out in places that aren't part of their, this is why there's an imperial postmaster in Venice, right? More so, I would say, the bounds of this book are the Bergamaschi dynasty. So it's not just the Habsburgs, it's the Bergamaschi, right? And where they go and where they're really predominant. They are not big in Tuscany. They don't get their foot in the door early enough. There are Tuscan merchants who run what are known as scarselle, basically merchant cooperatives that run mail and have their own kind of postal history. So in short, no, there are different postmasters and a different kind of Tuscan dynasty, which is active in the Grand Duchy, is active to an extent as the papal postmasters after a certain point. They kind of edge out the Bergamaschi. And then in Turin as well, I found that the Tuscans go to Turin and become the postmasters for the Savoyards. So some of the summer was me going to Turin and Florence and looking at their archives. And what I think is interesting is even though they are slightly different systems, and they're different dynasties in their way, it's the same kind of documentation. Like I immediately knew what I was looking at when I started to look at their records. So again, all of these systems are very much in dialogue with one another, as they have to be for the system to work.
Yeah, I just have a question. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the way that the couriers were compensated for the work that they were doing. So were they receiving specific salaries or like from the companies that they worked for, or was there an expectation that they would receive gratuities, or was there some sort of extractive process that they were able to exploit to get kind of like money or compensation like at various points along the way on their routes? And also, was there a specific kind of like a career development process that couriers would go through within these companies, or were they kind of hired from specific guilds, or did they work themselves up through the system? I was wondering if you could just comment on that.
Yeah, all good questions. Thank you. I'm looking to see if I've got an example of the. I don't think I have them here. I'll pull them up actually. So there's some really excellent documentation of the post office in Milan, and as I mentioned, it's because it gets audited, so they have to send everything to Spain, and they have to specifically show where their money's coming from and where their money's going. And these records were just so fantastic, especially because what I wasn't able to find in Spain, I did eventually find crammed in the back of a notary's book in Milan. And when I say crammed, I mean crammed, right? Like this is the kind of, so this was a whole process of taking photographs of these financial records and transcribing them and trying to make some sense of what the financial arrangement is at this point in time. One thing I do find is they're using double entry record keeping, which is interesting because that's actually fairly rare at the state level, but it's very common in commerce, right? And it just goes to show how much this system is both a business and a state office. So in terms of how the couriers are actually paid, this is under development in the period and it's highly contentious. So again, this audit, part of the reason this audit happens is because there's a number of disgruntled couriers who are more than willing to go to the visitor and tell all the stories about how they're being mistreated by the post office in Milan. And almost all of it is pay dispute. So theoretically, couriers earn a certain amount per post. So the longer distance journeys are paid more and paid at a higher rate. So for example, if you're running a local journey, it might just be, for example, 2 lira per post, and you only run 3 posts, meaning the distance between way stations. But if you're going all the way to Valladolid, that's clearly, it's compensated at both a higher rate and is much more money. I think there is some professional, you mentioned kind of how the professionalization happens. I think those long distance diplomatic couriers are still perhaps the most trained individuals, because they're having to navigate so many, boundaries and languages, et cetera. I think they're largely literate. I think that there's still, the local messengers are earning less on the whole, but they're also facing less risk, right? So it's kind of, and it's increasingly becoming a bit of a gig economy, and that's part of what they're complaining about, is that they're not getting paid at the rates they feel like they should. They're not getting as many jobs as they think they should be getting. So it's definitely a point of tension with the postmasters themselves, who are also trying to earn a profit, right? And increasingly leaseholders. They're not actually the postmistress in this case, but she's holding the lease of the postmastership of Milan from the cousin who's off in nobility in Spain, right? So again, it gets really hairy and very contentious. On the whole, I still think they're making an okay wage, but not as much as they think they should.
Yeah, so was that pay, sorry, was that coming from the actual companies that they work for, or was that just sort of expect, like, they could charge that to their clients that they were delivering mail for?
So essentially, these records are kept because the postmasters then go to the state.
Okay, right.
Basically, in order to send a courier, theoretically, again, this is still a state system. In order to send that courier, they have to get permission first. So they do a slip which goes off to the Treasury signs off on it. There's a whole process of documentation here. And then eventually, maybe once a quarter, they go to the state and say, here's the total amount we're due for all these missions that have been run. Now, that's being said, they have to front a lot of the capital themselves. They get reimbursed primarily. And so, again, that money can be very slow coming from the Habsburgs especially. And so there's this whole matter of, the private business that they're doing, which is paying per letter, right? Or paying by weight of letters. And so one of the things this audit uncovers is the degree to which they're actually serving the businessmen of Genoa, right? That the Genoese are essentially getting this kind of side service from the postal service because they're actually paying up front in part. Or at least they're good for it at the end of the day.
I'll just say, when I worked on some messengers in 15th century Rome, and there were these sort of instructions for what they were doing, it was clear that they were supposed to just line up and sort of take each job as it came randomly. And there was all this jockeying of people sort of realizing, if you go at a certain time of day, or if you get in a certain point in the line, you get the long distance job. And it pays more, and you'll get a tip at the other end.
Yes.
And so all these people are kind of loitering at the back of the courtyards and waiting for the long distance job, and meanwhile, the master of ceremonies or whatever is trying to get somebody to just take something across town, and no one will do it. I mean, it's like taxi drivers waiting to get a work job, right?
I need that reference.
Okay, yeah, and they're actually kind of like putting out rules about, no, you have to just take the next one that comes, and you can't pick and choose.
And this is true as well. They use the term volta, turn, right? Everybody, it's a turn system. You're gonna, and interestingly, the Venetians sometimes don't want to be sent on the long distance journeys because they're sent with the Venetian ambassador to kind of act as their personal channel back. And so sometimes they beg off of it like the Venetian ambassadors do. Like, no, I can't possibly right now. I'm sick. I'm, what have you.
It's exactly the same with pizza delivery.
Yeah. So tipping absolutely does happen, and it continues to, especially if you bring good news. It's great to bring good news. Like the right pope got elected, right? That's a good position to be in as the courier.
Thank you very much for the beautiful talk. I was particularly interested in how the post office postmasters seem to straddle the line between being the USPS and the NSA. They're sort of they're in the gray area between the two, right? I was wondering if in the law writing that they're doing, right, in the codification of their professional business and all of this that's happening in the legal areas, if there's any discussion about notions of privacy and how information is guarded or should be protected, and what's the pitch they're making to the state.
Great question. So the term, I spend a lot of time thinking about publicity and privacy in the book as a whole, right? I've got it in the title now. They don't use the term privacy, and privacy really only comes about, even in English, it's just coming around at the beginning of the 17th century to refer to what we think of it as, right? Think matters that need not concern the state. And actually, Shakespeare is great on this too, right? The references to privacy being, guarding against matters of the home, matters of the heart, things that don't need to concern the state as a potential source of security threat. So I think the way that the postmasters themselves discuss it is in terms of discretion, right? Because that's what they need to model, is they need to offer a certain level of discretion to all of their clients. And in fact, Ottavio Codogno, the same guy who's keeping these records, he writes a book which has a number of postal routes, and that's what I talked about yesterday, but it also has many chapters about how a postmaster should behave and behave towards his clients. So he writes about how a postmaster needs to keep matters occultissimo for both his, even the princes, but also the merchants. right? Otherwise, he will get a reputation as Cassandra, right? He will be a news teller, novelista, and then he won't be able to do any business. And then even by the time we're getting into the mid-17th century, I'm seeing the postmasters push back against their higher-ups when it comes to breaking the seal, especially, right? That they're increasingly catering to this mercantile community. And they say things like, breaking the seals of merchants is barbaric, right? So it's always in tension, right? And certainly by the time that I end the story, we see them, privacy rights being much more of an issue for the postmasters, for the way they advertise themselves to this private clientele. I mean, that's in part because they're trying to earn back some lost ground from Protestant systems, right? Who have that as a major advertising point, that you don't need to worry about the Habsburgs reading your letters.
Okay, thank you. I'm wondering, in terms of the dangers that were associated with travel, or also with the certain objects that they may have carried, did the couriers travel by themselves always, or were there ever specific instances when there were groups?
No, they very much like to travel in groups. Yeah, and especially in certain areas. So the term procaccio has a million different meanings, but one of them is the armed caravan, postal caravan that leaves from Rome to Naples. And we see travelers talking about traveling with this caravan, and it's originally intended for a safe delivery, but it's literally a caravan because banditry is so bad in the region between Rome and Naples. So yes, couriers absolutely try and travel with other folks. Ferrante Pallavicino, the author of that, he's traveling with couriers a lot of the time, actually, as he's fleeing from various persecuting states. And so, they like to travel together. They like to travel with other travelers. This becomes part of the reason that the postal system becomes a travel industry in many ways, right? So think of the postal stagecoach and that meaning it has for American travel. It's getting there in Europe by the end of the 17th century.
This is great. I have one question thinking about conflicts in terms of war and military occupation. You talk about how disease interferes and how things were put in place to kind of make sure post could still function.
Mm-hmm.
How was postal services interacting with those kind of conflicts? What you find is there seems to still be quite a lot of mail going back and forth between regions within Italy that are in conflict, and there doesn't seem to be too much of a holdup at certain times where I would expect it. And what comes to mind for me is the naval occupation of Perugia in the 1550s, that there's a lot of mail going from Perugia to Florence, even though there's tensions between the Pope and the Duke at the time. So what systems were in place to make sure that war didn't get in the way?
Yeah, great question. So that's really something that comes about in the first and second chapters, because you have to have those understandings about protecting the courier in order for any of this to work. Similar to the way that this kind of private mail carrying comes about with the plague, I see the first big success for the Tassos and their system coming about during the Italian Wars, which is interesting, right? But part of that is because there's this increasing consensus that you got to protect the courier, right? I won't mess with your mail if you don't mess with mine, at least outwardly. So there's one of the incidents that I spent a lot of time on is the arrest of the Spanish postmaster in Carafa, Rome, who was arrested for espionage, for being a part of a planned Spanish invasion, etc. This is so internationally condemned. Everyone jumps on board very quickly to say, what are you doing? You can't mess with the postmaster in this way, right? It's like messing with the diplomats, and even that understanding is starting to come into being of that kind of extraterritorial protection. So, amazingly, we do start to see this come about, and I think it's just because, again, people become so dependent on these systems that they need this understanding that even in times of war, you don't mess with the couriers. And that'll quite literally get written into some of the agreements and the treaties that are made. But it also, there's a couple incidents during the Italian Wars where I've seen, somebody gets harassed by soldiers and the higher-ups write to one another to say, I'm so sorry, if I'd known, I wouldn't have let this happen.
Thank you, Rachel, for sharing your work. I understand that being Bergamasco and being a courier is quasi-synonymic in the territory of Venice. But how about their self-proclaimed identity? Do you feel that it matters to be a Bergamasco or to claim to be one? Or do you actually become a go-between, so you belong to a sort of cosmopolitan, so to speak, world, because you become familiar with the various areas because you have to trade in those areas?
Yeah, great question. So when it really matters is at the start of the book and during this period of Italian wars, where I talk about the Tassis in particular as advertising themselves as Venetian imperials, right? And so, you know, someone like Simone Tassis, who's the postmaster in Milan in that period, he appears a ton in Marine Sanudo's diaries. Which he's actually the main source of news for the Venetians about what's going on in Milan. Right? And part of that, even while being this imperial agent, and it's hilarious because Sanudo will sometimes say, like, all these things are clearly things false and embellished by the imperial court, right? They understand that this is propaganda, right, that's coming from Simone, but again, it's the one channel. So they're going to take what they can get. And similarly, they're, you know, the Tassis are playing on that Bergamasco identity. One of the things they get is a series of feudalities in Istria. And that gets seized in the course of the Italian wars. And so they're going back and forth with the Venetians saying, look, we're Bergamasco, right? Like, you know, we're loyal to you as well as the emperor. We can do both. Please give us our property back. And in addition to needing to run those routes over each other's territories, right? So they're really mutually dependent. And the fact that they're Bergamasco, they absolutely play that up as saying, like, we're used to doing this. We can balance both of these identities.
Thank you very much. I was interested in your discussion of the particular instance where I think based out of Milan, they were penalties levied on the population of an area where the theft or banditry occurred. I was interested if there were records of enforcement of that policy or resistance to it, whether there was sort of any official reflection on its success or failure as a policy, and if it was something that was enacted elsewhere or whether that was a unique case.
Yeah, great question. I think actually I'm not sure that the policy ever was really implemented. I think it's something that the postmaster would have really liked to see happen, and like I said, he's has this hand in writing the legislation. They really want the governors to ride roughshod over the other authorities in Milan to make these things happen. Sometimes the governors are willing to do that, and sometimes they're not. And so there's one chapter where I get into why I think this legislation never really came to be in the way that that Codogno would have really wanted. Because for one thing, the Senate wasn't having any of this, right? And the degree to which the governors want to use their own political capital to force these things through depends on the time. So I think, in short, I don't think it actually came to pass, at least in the way that Codogno did. And one of the things that's interesting about going through the different drafts of the edict is seeing the number of different hands that go in and say, nope, can't do that, nope, can't do that. So there's one hand which I think is likely related to the Milan Senate, who's writing in the side, basically, this is as it has been, this is innovation, right? We're not on board for innovation. So it's very much a push and pull, and the local authorities aren't always on board with what the Spanish governor would want happening.
All right. Good place as any to wrap up. So thank you, everyone, for joining us.